Today I want to experiment with writing a data loading component. Now we're going to be working on the podcast page of ember.js. And if you come here and select an episode, scroll down, you'll see that at the bottom of this page we have this recent episodes section right here. And this shows the 3 recent episodes, not including the one we're currently on. So if we're currently on 60, we'll see 59, 58, and 57. But if we click on 59 and we scroll down, we see 60, 58, and 57. So let's pop over to the code base here and see how this is implemented. So this is the podcast episode route right here, and we just have a template route and controller. The route actually fetches the main podcast episode and finds it by slug, and that's the primary data for this episode page. So we render the video, and then we render, the title and the notes and the summary and everything. And then down here is where we render those recent episodes. And the way this is implemented is actually with a data loading component, because this data is kind of secondary, so we don't want to block the main render on this section. So you'll see we use UI hooks right here to go ahead and load the latest episodes. So we're going to perform this task, which lives on the controller. This is going to go ahead and fetch all the podcast episodes, only grab the recent 4, sorted by position, and then set those as instance data on the controller. And then in our template, once we have those, we'll go ahead and render a grid with a podcast card for each one of those episodes. And here's where we make sure the current episode is not in that list. So this is a fairly typical pattern that we use a lot when we want components to load data. We definitely rely on Ember concurrency tasks. And in this case, the task is on the controller, and we execute it from this hooks component, but often we use the exact same pattern from within a separate component. If we had pulled this out into a recent podcast episodes component, we would have just moved that task right onto the component, called it on did insert element, and this pattern would basically be exactly the same. So one thing I've wanted to experiment with for a while is how can we wrap up this logic here that calls the task, this logic here that is basically just querying using Ember data and actually Ember data storefront as well, and then setting some instance data here and rendering in the template. How might we be able to simplify all this? And one way is with a data loading component. So over here in the controller, this is really all here just so we can call store.loadRecords. And again, this load records API kind of comes from Ember data storefront, but it's very similar to store.query with some additional caching built into it. But what if we could just do this from the template? So I'm going to grab this right here, come over to the template, and let's just experiment with what this API might look like. So what if we had a load records component, and we could pass in the model name. In this case, we want to get the podcast episode. And then we also want to be able to pass in params like this. Now in a template, we can do this using the hash helper. So if we had an argument called params, we could use the hash helper here to pass in an object. And this just takes in a list of key value pairs. So sort would be position descending. And let's go ahead and move this to a new line here. And then we could also pass in a page, which itself is an object. We can see right here. So we'll use an S expression to pass in another hash. And in this case, we just need a limit of 4. So this is a pretty simple way to pass through JavaScript data to our component in the template layer. And this is pretty nice and declarative here. This gives us all the information we need to go ahead and execute this query. So if this component existed, we could go ahead and yield out the data as a result. And then down here where we actually render the grid, we could just copy this, move it to the block right here. And if we just named this data property that's yielded to latest episodes, in theory, we shouldn't have to change any of this. So this is kind of an API I've had in the back of my mind for a while. Let's go ahead and build this out and see if it works for us. Now, before I save this update right here, we can come over to our test suite, and I have this filtered down to the podcast episode page where we have our acceptance tests. We can see that the episode's details are visible, And we also have some tests covering the behavior for that recent episode section. So if I save this, I would expect this test suite to fail. And indeed, we get an error, cannot find the component load records. So let's start to build this out. We can go ahead and generate a component called load records. And we'll pop open load records component. Now I want this to be a tagless component, so I'll put tag name to the empty string. And let's come back to the controller, and I'll go ahead and grab this for reference. So I'm still going to want to use Ember concurrency, so we'll grab the task import right here. And let's just make this a little more generic. We'll call this query. And instead of setting a property here, I think we can just return the result from this call to load records. So because of the way we're using this in the template, we have a model name property and we have a params property here, which should be a hash. So let's go ahead and throw a debugger here, and we'll make sure to define a didInsertElement hook where we get the query and call perform on it. So let's save this and we can see what we got here. Now I have our local site running right here, and I'm already on the podcast page, and we hit that debugger. But just to show you, I am running this site locally, and we have some dummy data here that's going to let us work in development. So let's go ahead and refresh this on the podcast page. And here we're at the debugger in our new component. So this .model name should be podcast episode. And then let's look at this params, and we see it is a JavaScript object that looks exactly like what we want. So that means here in load records, we should be able to call this.store.loadRecords, this.model name, and then this entire params hash right here, we can just replace with this.params. So let's save this and come back and reload the page. All right, we're getting another error. Cannot read property load records of undefined. I think I just forgot to inject the store here since we're in a component. So I'll go ahead and import inject, and I'll just come here and inject the store. So now the page renders. We don't see the episodes because we haven't yielded them out yet. But over here, I do see 2 queries to our podcast episodes page with a limit of 4 and our sort. And I think that's because we still have back in our route template this UI hooks call up here. So I'll just go ahead and comment this out for now. And I think this query is working. All we need to do is yield out the data here. And we can use derive state from the Ember concurrency task to do this in the template. So in the template, we should just be able to yield out this.query.last.value. And just like that, we've got our recent episodes showing up again. And if we come over to our test suite, looks like that page is passing again. So let's see how this behaves when we kind of click around a little bit. I'm going to clear the console, and let's just go back to the podcast index page right here, and we'll start fresh. So here we see the initial call to get all the podcast episodes. Let's go ahead and clear the console. And when I visit one of these episodes, we do a get by slug to the actual episode, which is the model hook for the main part of this page. And then we see our component down there making a get request to the latest 4 episodes for this section right here. I'll clear this, and if we click to another episode, we see a new request for test before commit, which is the slug for this page, and we don't see that request for the component down here. This is kind of a cool side effect of the fact that we're transitioning routes here, but Ember is smart enough to know that this component is still mounted, so we're not going to hit this didInsertElement hook again, because this load component is being rendered on this routes template, and even though the model's changing, this template is still being rendered. So Ember's smart enough to know that we don't need to tear down and re-render this load records component, which is why we don't see any other network requests. However, if we go to view all episodes, We can see we're using Storefront's cache here, and there's no network request because we've already fetched all these. And if I go ahead and click on this episode again, we now actually see this request for the latest 4 episodes again because of that did insert element hook. So if I kind of go back and forward from the index page to this detail page, we see that we aren't background reloading any of the other data except for these recent episodes. Now we're still rendering from cache here. We can see it's instant and it renders before that network request comes back. So even though this component is being torn down and built back up again, because we're using Storefront, we can cache on this entire query right here, and this will resolve instantly with the value from the cache, and then it'll go ahead and trigger a background reload. And that's what we're seeing right here. But if we didn't want that background reload, we can also go ahead and expand our API a little bit and say, the recent episodes are probably not going to change within a single session of our app. So we can make this even more efficient and say something like background reload is false. So let's go ahead and add this API to our component. Now Storefront passes this through as a param to load records because that's the way ember.js API works. So let's go ahead and grab these params and we'll make a new hash right here. And we'll just create a new object and splat these like this. And then we'll say if this.background reload is not undefined. So this means if our consumer has actually passed it through, which in our case we have right here. So if it's not undefined, we'll go ahead and set params.background reload equal to this.background reload. And then we can go ahead and pass those params through right here. So if we save this, with any luck, when we come back to the app, we should see our background reload behavior has slightly changed. So now we're starting off on the hot reloading podcast episode. We see the request for the primary data and for the recent episodes section right here. Let's go ahead and clear the console. Come back to view all the episodes. Now we see the first time we visit this page, we need to get all the episodes to render this. Let's go ahead and come back to hot reloading. And we're still seeing that query. params.background reload, this.background reload. Let's drop a debugger right here and just see what's going on. Let's take a look at these params that we made. Background reload is the string false. Still getting used to these angle bracket components here. So just like we use the double curlies when passing in JavaScript data that's not a string, we want to pass through the value false right here. So we need to wrap this in curlies as well. You can imagine this being some property as well that's dynamic, but in our case, we want to pass through the actual value false. So let's save this, drop this debugger, and with any luck, when we come back, we'll get the behavior we were expecting. All right, so looking at the console, we have our initial requests. Let's clear those out. We'll come to the Ember Octane episode. We see the find slug behavior for that. We don't see the request for recent episodes, but that's because Ember is not re-rendering this component. If we go back to view all the episodes, we should see a request for all of them. And now if we come back to Octane, we don't see any requests. And I can go back and forward. There's no requests here. At this point, these pages are basically being rendered offline completely. We don't need the network to render any of this. Now, when we go to a new page, of course, we're going to block on getting the full data for that episode, but you'll see that this recent episodes section is still not making any network requests at all. So this is really cool. So let's come and clean some of this up. Because we have load records working now, right here, we don't need this UI hooks to trigger this load latest episodes task. We can come to the controller. We don't need this task at all, which means we don't need this controller at all. And lastly, one thing I've seen in other APIs that do something similar like this, use components to load data kind of generically, is yield out and is loading and is error state. So if we were to do something like this, this gives the consumer the ability to say, if this query is loading, let's go ahead and render some sort of spinner here. Else, if it errored, then we'll render something. Otherwise, we know we have the data and we can go ahead and render our grid. And this kind of puts these states front and center. I wasn't even handling these states in the existing code. So having them being yielded first is kind of nice just because it forces that on you. Now, I think it'd be really cool if we could, somehow destructure in handlebars so we can just grab the data that we need or the is loading state. But for now, I think I want to go ahead with this API just so the loading and error states are always kind of front and center. So we can save this and come back to our load records component. And I think we can just use derive state to get all these things. So loading is just going to be this.query.is running. An error is going to be if this.query.last has an error. And this is my first pass at this API. You could imagine yielding out more state about this query, like how many times it's been performed. But for now, I think this is pretty good for the general case. So with that saved, let's come back and check that this is actually still working here. It looks like it is. And our tests are passing. And let's see if that loading state works. We'll just try something simple. If is loading. Let's render an H1. Loading. Otherwise, if we have the latest episodes, we'll render the grid. Save this, come back. And if you saw it down there, it was pretty quick. We can actually just come to our Mirage config. Right here, find the podcast episodes and just set the timing to, let's say, 1500. And there we can see the loading message render and then the new episodes pop in. So it looks like our data loading component is working. So I'll just go ahead and undo this for now just to put this back to kind of where it was. So this is a simple refactoring, no change in behavior. And I really like this because it just reduces the amount of decisions we have to make. If I need to load some data outside of the route, I can just use this load records component. And you can imagine making one for loading a single record, which has basically a similar signature, but also takes an ID. But having this declarative component that's in handlebars, not having to mess with creating a new Ember concurrency task or performing it, not having to make a controller and figuring out the best way to perform that task. There's something really nice about this declarative syntax, and keeping it in handlebars gives us all the guarantees that we normally get with Ember components and declarative rendering. So if our UI is always a function of these states right here, we can have some guarantees that everything's going to kind of be in sync. And looking at this component, it's actually pretty simple. We end up with here, we've got the component right here, and we can go ahead and open the template. This is not bad at all. It's basically just a pass through to some of the APIs on Ember Data Store as well as Storefront. And the fact that the caching is taken care of at the service layer, independent of how and when this component is rendered, is really powerful. So we've really come to like this architecture, and it feels like the boundaries are correct. We have this caching behavior. The data needed for that component is specified in a simple way. But once we go back and forth between pages that we've already loaded data for, and now that the Mirage server is slower, you can really tell the difference, right? When I click on a new one, it kind of pauses for a little bit to get the new primary data. But once we have it, we can go back and forward. And even though this component is being rendered and torn down, Ember Data and Ember Data Storefront's cache is working for us. So I hope you found this useful. We're definitely going to keep pulling on this thread of loading data in components in our templates, and I'm really excited to see where this goes.